Okay. Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'na wa anfa'na bima alamtana wa zidna ilman. Allahumma irna al-haqqa haqqan warzuqna itba'a wa irna al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtanaba. Rabbana la tuzigh qulubana ba'da idh hadaytana wa hab lana min ladunka rahma innaka antal wahhab. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa atba'i ajma'in. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are continuing our discussion, reading the 11th word. This is our fourth, I think, sitting. And the 11th word, recapping a little bit of the discussion so far, started out with the verses from Surah chapter 91, Surah Shams, and we talked in the beginning of this discussion series that the apparent emphasis of this section by the author will be on this verse that is highlighted here by the soul and the order, and proportion given it. And so what this section that we've been discussing serves to do is essentially helps interpret this verse, but also that the author uses this method that he picks up or deciphers or deduces from the Quran to apply it to our own experience also. So as I'm also been curious about why is it that the author, how is this section an interpretation of this verse or these verses? I'll also offer some of my reflections thinking about this question. What is the method by which this author is interpreting the verse, but also how does he use the verse to interpret or apply it to human existence? Okay, so we talked about the fact that the soul over here appears to refer to the side of the human self that is commonly referred to as the egoistic side of the human being, the part of the human being that is through its choice, through its ability to make a choice, is able to choose between what is termed the right and the wrong. So it has the ability to choose something that appears to not reflect the inherent reality of the things or the experience that it has, but it is able to choose something alternative to it. And the way that this author is, in this section, then refers or addresses this part of humanity or the human self that is using its senses, our physical senses, sight, seeing, smell, taste, feelings, and using those, as we talked about, as windows into informing or illuminating, I guess, the spirit that exists in the human being, or that side of the human being that is conscious or displays a consciousness and looks towards its source of itself. So the section started out by setting up an analogy, and this is something that we've been very familiar with up till now in the several sections we've read before. And so I'll just briefly summarize the analogies set up thus far, and then we can go into reading the analogy unfold. But we are invited to imagine a palace, something that is owned by a presumed king, and he has lots of treasures and jewels and things that, you know, he owns, and he wants to display them. And because he wants to display them, and two, the second aspect was it so that he could look through the view of others. We talked about these two aspects as being, the first one being that there is no reason why the king in this case, considering it to be the reference to an absolute creator or source of existence, being absolute, there is no need or necessity or reason to display or showcase his qualities other than for himself, because that's sort of the meaning that we understand from absolute, one that is not in need or dependent on anything else. And so that he could look through the view of others is something that I understand as that things that are created or things that come into existence in their being are looking towards their source of existence. And so in their being what they are, their qualities point to the one who is the source of those qualities. And so there's this sort of palace or exhibition set up, and within it, you know, the human being is invited under the auspices of a commander or someone that we can better understand as a guide. And I think we discussed quite a bit about how this analogy can be related to our circumstances in this world. And this is something that I think has been a good point of reflection, looking back at the verses, which do start with by the sun and its glorious splendor, by the moon, by the night. And all of these things, in essence, to me, appear to point to saying to a human being or to us to really seriously reflect or observe and study that which surrounds us, which includes, you know, ourselves too, like our own thoughts, our own feelings, looking within, looking outside. And I find that, you know, references to some things like the sun and the moon and the night and day are, to me, as an observer, also point out to their obviousness, or their, you know, like a sun and a moon, night and day, is sort of very extremely apparent and obvious. And so those just sort of indicate to me everything else that is also obvious and apparent, such as my own thoughts, and to look at them seriously as those elements that are described to be jewels and treasuries in a palace. Like you enter, let's say, an exhibition, and you are immediately drawn to the things, the objects within there. And of course, something that is really big or positioned in some place where it's right in front of you will immediately catch your attention. But that does not mean that everything else, placed in those areas is of a different nature. They're all meant to serve the same purpose. So this sort of idea of looking at this verse, teaching us to the method by which one should, I guess, reflect in their own creation or experience, but at the same time, letting our experience, using that sort of experience of, let's say, the sun and the moon, bringing that experience back to these verses is an interesting thing to think about, and something that I also have been trying to reflect on, is thinking that the words on the page, or if you listen to these verses, knowing the source of this speech, you can also sort of read these verses as modes of reflection, similar to how you would think of, the sun as a mode of reflection. So this sort of sets the stage within which the human being or the individual is invited or exists in the world to reflect uh, on things that exist. And then I think the main point, as I'm also trying to explore, is looking at this particular section of the verse as we continue the discussion. So moving on, we ended somewhere in the middle, towards the end of this page. But to recap, the palace that you're invited into is not something that is just sort of created and then sort of left on its own, but rather there another element to it, which is that of the author describes it as a supreme commander, represented in the example of the prophet or prophethood. And it is described as a individual, as someone, a teacher, a guide, who is familiar and knows as it says, the purposes of the palace and the meaning of its contents. This was also, I think, a very crucial point in understanding this experience for me, because I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, for example, if I enter a museum or I enter a exhibition, or however you want to imagine a place where you're invited, let's say. And it's very unusual, and I don't think we do have these experiences, or when we do, we find them a little bit unusual, that you enter a museum or an exhibition and you do not find any sort of information about how to walk about that place. There are usually arrows on the floor and they give you a general direction, or there are things on the, next to the pieces, or in other words, someone has curated it and is guiding you through it. And so alternatively, the experience of entering, let's say, a very grand, beautiful museum or whatever, without any of those elements of guidance, would to me appear to be head towards the idea of meaninglessness still, because you can set up something really beautiful, but if you do not guide or guide someone through the optimal way of experiencing it, makes me think, like, what is the point of this place anyways then? If I'm just meant to go around doing everything the way that I want to do, like it loses that a sense of meaning for me. And so the idea of someone like the prophet for existence and someone like a guide in this palace is as essential to the place as the place itself. So and I think this is something that we may have discussed in other sections or in other discussions, is this sort of proof of prophethood existing within the proof of the source of an absolute source itself. So when we say La ilaha illallah, we also say Muhammadur Rasulullah. And why is it that these two things are tied together? And I remember in previous discussions from the same author, his argument, which seems to me to be evident here, is also that the proof of the existence of a creator is contained within the proof of prophethood and vice versa. And so it is within this auspices of this commander that one who's an instructor, who's a teacher, who knows the space and the meanings that are contained with them, who you look towards in order to, I guess, take advantage or make the most of the invitation that you've been given to. So I believe we ended somewhere in the middle of this paragraph over here. I will quickly read this first paragraph and then go into the author's explanation of these the analogy that he set up. Um, obviously, at any time, if you have a comment or question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat box. But we'll start reading from O People. O people, by making this palace, sorry, okay. O people, by making this palace and displaying these things, our Lord, who is the king of the palace, wants to make himself known to you. You therefore should recognize him and try to get to know him. And with these adornments, he wants to make himself loved by you. Also, he shows his love for you through these bounties that you see, so you should love him too by obeying him. And through these bounties and gifts, which are to be seen, he shows his compassion and kindness for you. So you should show your respect for him by offering thanks. And through these works of his perfection, he wants to display his transcendent beauty to you. So you should show your eagerness to see him and gain his regard. And through placing a particular stamp and special seal and an inimitable signet on every one of these adorned works of art that you see, he wants to show that everything is particular to him and is the work of his own hand, and that he is single and unique and independent and removed. You therefore should recognize that he is single and alone, and without peer or like or match, and accept that he is such. He spoke further fitting words to the spectators like these concerning the king and the station. Then the people who had entered the place separated into two groups. So the part we just read was an imagined quotation, I guess, from the teacher and instructor, telling or sort of explaining to the crowd, which is gathered in this place, about what this all essentially means and how to act in this space. Before moving on, I think I just want to discuss like the main message that I got from these lines sort of pointed to one main thing for me, which had to do with the establishment of a conscious nature of one's experience, and hence a connection with a conscious experience of, or a conscious connection of our experience. And what I mean by that is, as I was going back to this idea that this section is sort of interpreting those verses, what I'm understanding is that by calling our attention to different elements of this of our experience, and particularly addressing the human being that can sort of inculcate or reflect qualities of reflection and thought and deep reflection, it is pointing us to being to awakening some level of consciousness in us. Like these verses appear to me to provoke or call to an awakening. And I'll just sort of give a small example that I was reflecting on this while I was on a plane recently. And as the plane sort of got above the clouds, it became so easy to look at the expanseness. It was a really thin first or second night of the moon, and there were stars, and like, there was such an expansiveness and beauty that it became very easy for me to suddenly think about like, oh yeah, this is so beautiful, this is amazing. Of course, this has a source and I need to think about it, and reflect on it and just spend some time thinking about this. But as we got back underneath the cloud, suddenly the cityscape appeared, and that thought of wanting to reflect and being conscious suddenly started to escape from me. And I started to think why that was the case, like, because perhaps suddenly I'm thinking that the cityscape is not uh, connecting me to the source of those things, but rather is making me think about sort of all the human activity. And it was in that struggle that I started to think about the need to have a level of awareness and a consciousness that allows one to remain connected to this idea of that of a creator, or of an order, of will, of meaning, of like everything being for a particular reason. But what the cityscape meant to me was that it shifted a worldview for me. So something above the clouds seemed like, my worldview was informed by complete trying to acknowledge the source of existence, and thinking and reflecting about what all of this means. Like, thinking of myself as, the group in the palace would be like, oh yeah, this moon, this star is a reflection of the qualities of the creator. But underneath the clouds, I'm thinking of what we'll read to be the second group of individuals who will just think about things in and of themselves, not being able to see them as reflection of those qualities. And I sort of diagnosed this as to myself as being influenced by sort of the worldview that predominates for us these days, which is that the cities and the way that things are designed, the way that our lives are pretty much constructed from a worldview that looks towards things in and of themselves. And there is no sort of connection to a divine being, but rather it is all gain and benefit, as if it is coming from the things itself. And so therefore, people are looking, the general construction of our experience is also to just sort of benefit as much as one can in material gains, or within the the confines of our lived life, and not in terms of meaning. So I hope this was a little bit clear, that the idea being that these verses are telling or are invoking a level of consciousness, really trying to tell one to think, reflect deeply. And then I think that, coming up with those abilities to then apply it back to these verses is how I'm understanding this section to be teaching us on interpreting the Quran for ourselves. And I'd be curious if this it's almost like it's very simple. If I put it, in simple words, it's sort of like you read the Quran, and the Quran or the verses of the Quran, like help you read yourself and the universe. So it is an exchange. It is a dialogue that is mediated by a conscious reflection of the true nature and the true reality of the human experience. And this is instructed or taught to us through figures or appointed individuals represented in the let's say the institution of prophethood. And as this author has sort of made sure to highlight, that with the existence of a palace, there is a necessary existence for an instructor or teacher to tell you and show you what its purpose and meaning and its engagement with it should be. There are several other points in this particular paragraph, and one that I think directly comes out of this idea of conscious connection is sort of a response to it. And I think there are several places here where the author will say that, like, for example, he's showing the owner of the palace is showing his love to you by the details and the ornaments and, all the sort of the beauty of the place. And so you should show your love to him by obeying him. Similarly, I think his compassion and kindness for you, so you should show your respect for him by offering thanks. And I understand this as sort of not one, I mean, we've talked about these things in various other discussions, is sort of like how we also experience things in our own life. You are given a gift by someone, and your impulse is to say something or to do something. And in our society, or in the way that we've grown up, or however that you want to understand it, the common or the expected reaction is to say thank you. The care and the compassion and kindness that someone shows, you return it with an appropriate gesture. So I understand this as just sort of like what is being taught to you is like, what is the best or the most appropriate gesture to recognize the different sort of qualities or, let's say, emotion that one may experience in their in their being or in their experience of the universe. So moving on, now the author will describe two groups of people. And this is again a concept that we have been a little bit familiarized with in previous sections. And the fact that this discussion had started, and we had emphasized in the beginning of this discussion, trying to keep an emphasis, or at least Dr. Ali had said, and we are supposed to sort of understand to what extent is this true or not, is the particular focus on the last bit of the verse, which calls to the soul. And over here, I think it becomes even more clear, that element of the verse is, being discussed. Like we've talked about it in previous sections, there's always like two types of people, or they're two brothers, or there's always like either a right path and a left path, or two attitudes, let's say, or two worldviews. In my analogy, one above the clouds and one below the clouds. And so in this part 2, we are introduced to two groups, and I'll just read out the first group and see where we'd like to stop. The first group: since these people had self-knowledge, were intelligent, and their hearts were in the right place, when they looked at the wonders inside the palace, they declared, "There are great matters afoot here." They understood that it was not in vain or some trifling plaything. They were curious, and while wondering, "I wonder what the talisman to this is and what it contains," they suddenly heard the speech the master and instructor was giving, and they realized that the keys to all the mysteries were with him. So they approached him and said, "Peace be upon you, O Master. By rights, a truthful and exact instructor like you is necessary. For a magnificent palace such as this, please tell us what our Lord has made known to you." First of all, the master repeated the speech to them. They listened carefully, and accepting it profited greatly. They acted as the king wished, And because the king was pleased at their becoming conduct and manners, he invited them to another special, elevated, ineffable palace, and he bestowed it on them in a way worthy of such a munificent king, and fitting for such obedient subjects, and suitable for such well mannered guests, and appropriate to such an elevated palace. He made them permanently happy. As for the second group, because their minds were corrupted and their hearts extinguished when they entered the palace, they were defeated by their evil commanding souls and took notice of nothing apart from the delicious foods. They closed their eyes to all the virtues and stopped up their ears to the guidance of the master, peace be upon him, and the warnings of his students. They stuffed themselves like animals, then sank into sleep. They quaffed elixirs which had been prepared for certain other matters and were not to have been consumed. Then they became drunk and started shouting so much they greatly upset the other spectating guests. They were ill mannered in the face of the glorious maker's rules, so the soldiers of the palace's owner arrested them and cast them into a prison appropriate to such unmannerly people. O friend, who is listening to this story with me, of course you have understood that the glorious Creator built this palace for the above mentioned aims. The achievement of these aims is dependent on two things: the existence of the Master, peace be upon him, whom we saw and whose speech we heard, because if not for him, all the aims would have been futile. For an incomprehensible book with no author consists only of meaningless paper. The second is the people listening to the master's words and accepting them. That is to say, the master's existence is the cause of the palace's existence. And the people's listening to him is the cause of the continuation of the palace's existence. In which case, it may be said that if it had not been for the master, the glorious king would not have built the palace. And again, it may be said that when the people do not heed the master's instructions, the palace will of a certainty be transformed and changed. Okay, so we are described the two groups, two attitudes, two worldviews, two choices. And these two reasons, we can get to them. And I think part of this was mentioned earlier in the discussion today, but are in fact very essential. One of the things that caught my attention that I wanted to sort of elaborate on further, or see what people's own thoughts were. So this idea of like people had self-knowledge, were intelligent, and their hearts were in the right place. Now, this could be a figure of speech, a way of saying something, but it could also mean something more than that, that we can help sort of understand as to what kind of a person is described to have a heart in the right place, quote unquote, or what is this? What does this require, or what does this mean? And opening this idea further. But if you were essentially to summarize these two groups, it is quite clear that one group is, and if I could use the word sincere in their assessment and their study and their observation, they, without bringing in biases or, their already, like, for example, having preconceived sort of goals to what they want to do, with what they see, or letting any sort of, like, I guess biases is a good word. I think caprices is another word that we've used in the past in these discussions. So people, and again, I'm going to go back to how I think about these verses, is that when they start with by the sun, by the moon, by the light, by the day, like it is only asking one to just reflect on things as they are, and uh, perhaps using, as I understand for myself, words or images like the sun and the moon and the light in the day are like almost sort of without sort of confusion to anyone. You know, I don't think there's anybody who would disagree that looking at the sun, that's not the sun, and a moon is not the moon, or a day is not, it's not daytime. The fact that these things are so plain and evident and to be seen such that is something that I think is what is represented in this first group of people, is that they're not bringing in any other notions of what the reality is other than letting the reality speak for itself, which is to carefully observe the qualities of those things and the nature of that thing and letting that inform one's conclusion. And I think this is something that we discussed in previous discussions too, as the method of this that the author is trying to introduce is one that is based out of one's careful observation of reality, however, you know, sincerely and diligently one tries to study it. And so there is nothing that is, you know, left to speculation, nothing that you should conclude or say that does not have a reason with you, whether in observation or logical conclusion or, and so forth. And so your conclusion is based on how things are, like your proof is sitting within the nature of the thing themselves and not something that one can claim that they heard from someone else or you know, read somewhere, and that's why one is making this claim. And I guess if I were to interpret this idea of heart in the right place, to me, this points to a level of sincerity, which is connecting one to the purpose of, you know, doing things in the proper manner, and following up, you know, the right method or the right way of understanding something in which it must be understood, and not for any other sort of material, personal, or any other sort of gain that in effect you know, pollutes one's way of thinking about things. And so this group is also saying that I wonder what the talisman to this is and what it contains. So another way that I can reflect on the verses is thinking that a human being, it seems a little bit natural to me that if one sees the sun, it is very obvious that one tries to think about, okay, what is it made of? Okay, where is it? How big is it? You know, how does it sort of like stay suspended in space? So it's not just that you see it and that's it, but rather you start to think about more questions. And I think this is what this group here is also showing, is that it induces a sense of wonder of like, okay, whatever this beauty and adornment or, you know, describing in this palace is, like, what is there more to it, you know, and whether that is looking to the meaning side of things or wanting to gain more knowledge about, you know, who is this individual who has put up this you know, exhibition, and why, and, you know, how do you get to know more and more about the experience that you're having, and perhaps knowing that if this beauty exists, there must be more, and not sort of limiting yourself to reflection, to, you know, just to the surface level of things, but going further than that. So we have a comment. Agabe says, those sentences below also make me understand how their hearts are in the right place. there's something going on here. I have to admit that it is not a play being wondered as the first step. Yes, I think I'll agree there that um, the comment that their hearts are in the right place are able to, or this is the side of an individual that sort of indicates they're thinking that things are not in vain or meaningless, and this is not just some, you know, sort of fun and play in the sense of like it has no purpose, and we can apply this to our own life in thinking about whether it's the joys or the sorrows or the difficult times, which I think is a popular, not popular, but a common issue is in thinking about. Um, it, I often feel like I despair when I think about difficult times in my life having sort of no meaning and being purposeless. And I think at that moment, one can reflect on themselves and say, okay, am I really trying to understand my situation or my feelings in a way that is not clouded by, information or thoughts that are not real or not existent? And so thinking about things that they have a meaning, a purpose, what could it be? You wonder about sort of like the beauty of those meanings, the greatness of those purposes, and you start to become, I think, even more serious about those things. And I can't help but sort of refer back to the verses in the sense that, you know, when reflecting on daily, on our existence, sun, moon, being the example I'm repeating, is that a person who is really serious, let's say, about anything that fascinates them or they wonder about, and I often think about, young people with hobbies or interests, or even people who are researchers or something, they become so fascinated by an object or something that they start to research more and more and more into it, and they become obsessed with it. And they don't see that, they don't look at, like, let's say a plant or an insect, and they're like, oh, all of these processes or this, things happening have no purpose. Instead, it is because they think that it has an intricate sort of order and mechanisms that are governing it, that increases their curiosity and their seriousness and commitment to wanting to discover more. And it's something that it appears to be very cyclical. The more that you reflect on something consciously and seriously, the more the more intensely will you want to discover it further. And so it's something like of a multiplication process, as I understand, which can go both ways, in the case of the first group and the second group. So, and I guess this, as I'm thinking about it, I also connected to the idea of, like, why certain images are often repeated in divine speech, or why also in our own daily lives we repeat the same sort of verses and speech. And I think this method, as I understand that, is showing is illuminating a method that indicates that there is a depth and a vastness possible should this be understood, in the manner that we are thinking about right now. All right, so moving to the second group, unless there is anything that particularly caught anybody's attention in the first. One thing that will come up again, but is important to, I guess, mention throughout, is that this group does not just realize that there is a meaning to the palace on its own, but they do it in light of the instruction and the message given by the instructor. So I'm not sure how much to read into this, but the fact that this quote above was not just sort of given to the first group, but it was given to both of them. And it was following this sort of instruction that one group, reflects it in one way and another reflects it in another way. And so the existence of the palace is, tied with and cannot be separated from the necessity of the instructor of that palace, who sort of indicates and shows what is in fact the meaning of this place. Okay, so question in the comment section, Tolu asks, is the difference between the groups inherent or more like a conscious choice? I think it's, are they choosing the groups or is this how they found themselves? So as I understand the way that we've been reading this, and if I, try to extract my own comments from how this author has structured the analogy, I would say that it is a choice that is available to a human being who has a soul or an egotistical side of him or herself, but at the same time also has a spirit, or the ruh, as we had talked about it before. And the fact that we talked about that this sort of these verses, or that we'll specifically try and see how this section addresses the verse number 7 of this chapter, which is by the soul and the order and the proportion given to it. If I take even the structure or the order with which this comes about and how the author is coming to taking it about, it is only after you have been invited into the palace, everyone's invited, everyone has been, whoever is aware of their existence is existing. There is an instructor that comes with the existence of the palace. It's not something that comes, like ad hoc, like separately. It's something that is embedded within, and the instructor's teachings are for all. And it is only following those teachings that one group connects the teachings of the instructor to their experience, and the other one does not connect, does not make any sense of the meanings of the teachings of the instructor to the experience, and they sort of separate them. And the fact that if you were to understand this section to be addressing the soul, or the nafs, as we talked in an earlier discussion of the same section, I would say that to me it really does seem evident that it is something that a choice someone makes in light of despite the evidence given to them, both in sort of experience and also in instruction. So the analogy here is you have the experience of existence of your life, and then you have an instruction which is in the form of divine speech delivered by prophets, or in this case the Quran by Prophet Muhammad. So I'm pretty much reading it as addressing that element of in all of us that has the ability to choose between the first and the second. And of course, I do not personally see this as being sort of fixed in any way. That, for example, the fact that we are in these discussions and we acknowledge all of these facts, such as the existence of a creator and a prophet and divine speech, does not mean that I do not fall into tendencies of the second group at times, at many times. So I do not see them as two different individual groups, but rather two aspects that are possible within the same human experience and are sort of experienced all the time by, I think, all of us. Um, Agabe says, another word caught my mind is while they are wondering, they wonder continuously and started wondering what instructor says. Yeah. I think what Agabe says reminds me of the comment that I was trying to explain earlier, which was this idea that that this reflection sort of feeds further reflection. Like uh, it does not stop, or theoretically, as I understand, it does not stop. Although practically, I think it does for us, and that to me, and I reflect this as being oscillating, or like going between the first group and the second group. And so when I think about this in my own particular life circumstances, I reflect it in a similar manner. It's like when I think I'm not being curious or reflecting and conscious, and I'm looking outside and I'm like, why is it that I'm not finding, any sort of wonder and curiosity or peace or, fascination with my experience around me? At that moment, I have to try and think about it and say, okay, what is my worldview like, at this moment? Like, are my connections, all sound? Like, it's for example, like, when your computer device or uh, something stops working, and if it's connected to different wires, then if the computer stops working, then you start to look at all the connections, like, okay, is this wire connected to this wire and this wire and this wire? And I do think that, yes, often at times those connections sort of, for me at least, start to uh, come loose. And it's a moment for me to reflect again. And so the symptom is that if I'm not wondering, if I'm not curious, if I'm not asking questions, if I'm not finding sort of pleasure in reflection and conscious sort of you know contemplation, let's say, then there's something that is broken connection somewhere. And it's an indication to uh, you know think about why that might be the case. So when I think about the people I would imagine, like prophets or others that have are considered to have been sort of close to God by different communities and people, I think about sort of a relentless, constant, disciplined, attitude in this, to be experiencing what we think this first group is experiencing. Whereas in the second group, I think once you're lost, then I think there's no really direction or movement. So Agabe says there must be also teaching of this instructor how we should connect to our creator, as in your experience, below the clouds, our very daily life, not only above the clouds. That's true. Dr. Ali, you have your hand up. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Just to change the voice, I just want to share my conclusion from the first group and the second group, especially in the beginning of the second group. The language is used as because their minds were corrupted and their hearts extinguished. Now, what we understand from this phrase is if from birth or from creation, their minds were corrupted, their hearts extinguished. That's why when they entered the palace, they just interpreted everything in a completely unrealistic base. Whereas the first group was self-knowledge, were intelligent, and their hearts were in the right place. Again, it sounds as if from the creation, their hearts were in the right place. As Talu asked the question and you answered, and you said, and also just maybe it needs more emphasis. You said because of their bias attitude. I think that was the key point. First of all, everybody is created given the same qualities, almost the same qualities of intelligence or heart with feelings. Before we look at the universe, before we listen to this teacher, instructor, employed by the creator of the universe and of the human being, we make our minds up. How? We make the choice. We say, I am going to have no bias, or it means, let me see what this universe is all about. Or other way around, I may make my bias decision saying that, look, I'm not going to give up my existence, my free will, to anything else than myself. It means everybody takes an attitude and then looks at the universe and then listens to the instructor's speech or his mission, really, what he is performing here, and then interpret the universe and then take an attitude either supporting or rejecting the instructor's message. Because the instructor's message and the universe must be compatible with what human nature is created for, or is created in order to understand and communicate with it. Because I closed my curtains and then sun doesn't come and say it is not light, or because I didn't close, this is important, didn't close my curtain and sunlight comes into my house and I see, oh, it is light, and I can confirm it because I can make the distinction between light and darkness, between meaningfulness or meaninglessness. I can understand whether appropriate to human feelings or contradicts the human feelings. Now I understand that the Quran always mentions about the evidence of the universe as the beginning of the verses displayed, and the Prophet also speaks by bringing the evidence of the universe and presents their information they gathered from the creator to human beings under the witnessing of the universe. This is our reality, and we have to, first of all, before listening to the prophet, before looking at the universe, we have to open up our minds, our hearts, with no preconditioned attitude, which is unbiased attitude. Then we can understand and confirm it. That's what I understood, not from the creation that our hearts are corrupt or our minds are really open and intelligent, and our feelings, our heart is open to the truth, what the reality of the universe shows, what the reality of the message the instructor presents to us from the creator. That's what I understood from these two groups' attitudes. Thank you.
Thank you. Tolu, if you have any additional comments, I think the matter has been cleared, that it's not something inherent you're born with, but something that you you can, have, whether it's, you can understand this as like something that is part of conditioning or living, that we can grow up to have certain biases, and we kind of tend to have them for many things without knowing why and what they are, unless we question them and make a conscious effort to reflect on them and put them aside before any sort of serious investigation. Okay, so we are at time, and if there are any sort of lingering comments, questions, thoughts, feel free to share. I think from next week, we will, or the moderator will probably sort of finish up if there is any part of this second group that might be of interest, and move into these two very important reasons or aims. So sort of the foundations of the fulfillment of the aim of this palace. So with that, I will conclude with the dua. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين بحرمة السر